Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. I'm going to introduce this podcast with a bit of Gerard Butler, and I kind of hope that he'll agree to come on again.
There is no again. You're going to die down there alone, cut off from the rest of the world.
Ah, that went well.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away by the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation that just how difficult it is to make a film. And I'm just glad that they somehow managed to get made. We've got a bit of a White House battle going on in this episode of Film Stories, though, as I'm putting two films that very much competed back head to head. Let's kick off with the first of the two, then. We're going to go back to 2013. We're going back to Gerard Butler. I'm going to play you a clip from the first of the films. We'll come to the story the other side of this.
Mr. President, 5 minutes, sir. Evening, ma'am.
Merry Christmas, Mike.
Mustang, this is Big Top, bringing out the full package.
Where'd that come from?
Everybody knows you did the right thing on that bridge. Even the president knows. You gotta learn how to get back into the real world.
Mr. President, we're ready for you.
Our guests have arrived. I'd like to welcome you to the White House, sir. Sir, there's been an intrusion. Let's go, move.
And that's all from 2013's Olympus Has Fallen, directed by Antoine Fuqua and written by Creighton Rothenberger and Katrin Benedict, with a cast led by Gerard Butler, Aaron Eckhart, Morgan Freeman, Angela Bassett, Robert Forster, Cole Hauser, Finley Jacobson, Ashley Judd, Melissa Leo, Dylan McDermott. A quite extensive ensemble for the film. And so let's start this one towards the late noughties, if you like, and the start of the 2010s, when a pair of screenwriters by the name of Creighton Rothenberger and Katrin Benedict, they were beginning to get somewhere after several years struggling to break into Hollywood. The pair would finally hit pay dirt just in early 2012s, really, but they'd actually first met in Philadelphia back in the year 2000 when they were in the same screenwriting class. Now, both of them then went off and had differing corporate careers. In the case of Rothenberger, he would take his corporate job, he would do screenwriting classes at night, and it would get to the point where he'd be getting up early in the morning so he could do his writing before he went off to be a posh corporate person. And as he explained in 2002, he said, "I was fortunate enough to win the Academy Nickel Fellowship with a Korean war epic script called The Chosin." Now, the thing is, this was a script writing contest, and they're often looked down upon. I don't know why, but both Rothenberger and Benedict have made the point that it was a script writing contest in this case that really gave them the break. In the case of Rothenberger, he would add, "It really gave me the confidence and impetus to focus solely on screenwriting as a career." And so he and Katrin Benedict, they started to write together, and by 2007 they decided to up sticks, quit their corporate jobs and go to California. And so they became writing partners and real life partners, but writing partners as well, putting together a series of spec scripts that were getting varying degrees of interest, that they were putting their work out to market. They weren't quite getting a bite, But it wasn't until 2011 that the corner really was turned. And that was off the back of a spec script that I've got no idea if ever got made. I see no record of it, called Callie. Now, I explain spec scripts quite a lot on this podcast. If you're unfamiliar with them, it is as it sounds, a script written on spec with no one paying for the development. All the risk is on the writer, and the hope is you get a nice big check when you sell it, which sort of happened with both of the films I'm talking about in this episode, oddly enough. Off the back of Callie, the writing partnership managed to get representation from a major Hollywood agency, in this case the Gersh agency. And now with new agents, what they decided to do was, well, they went over their collection of work, because over 9 years of writing together, Rothenberger and Benedict had put together over 20 screenplays that were pretty much ready to take out to market. And from that pile, one was plucked called Olympus Has Fallen. Now, Rothenberger would explain to Script Mag that the original idea for this particular project came when he began considering what the most impossible building in the world to take over would be. And he concluded, well, that's going to be the White House in Washington, D.C. in America. Then he threw in another ingredient, a Secret Service agent as a hero, and he had the fabric for what was a bit of a Die Hard in the White House kind of action movie, which would become Olympus Has Fallen. And the pair had always looked at this as a project that they felt could and should sell. It just hadn't before, but with encouragement from the Gersh agency, what they did is they spent a period of, about 4 or 5 months going back over the script, starting in the autumn of 2011, and they did 4 full rewrites of the film. Now, the changes that they brought around, they beefed up the lead character, Mike Banning, for a start. That would help attract a major action star, goes the thinking. And also, they took out quite a lot of the political dialogue. That even though they had a film set in the White House in America that was ostensibly about trying to save the President of the United States, the original drafts went quite political, and the later ones just didn't. They stripped it all out because they were advised, and they agreed with this, that people wouldn't be going along to see the film for any kind of political lecture or a chat about politics. They wanted to see an action movie, and an action movie was what they were going to get. Now, by the spring of 2012, the new draft was ready to send out to market, and Gersh put that back out, and they soon landed a bite for it. As Rothenberger would tell the Blacklist, he said it was a really interesting process. He said, Katrin and I, we've been writing for several years now, but with a proverbial 9-year overnight success, that their script sold, and they were reported as first-time screenwriters, even though they'd been just working away on this for a good decade or so. However, in March 2012, a deal was struck with the sizable independent outfit Millennium Films to make the picture. Now, it wasn't a major, but it was certainly nimble, and it certainly had resources. And in the eyes of Millennium, it had no intention of buying a picture like this and not getting it moving quickly. As such, who are you going to call? Well, in this case, it was Gerard Butler, who was very, very quickly linked with the film. That the deal was done in March 2012, and Butler was on board by the end of March 2012 as well. Now, at this stage in his career, he'd headlined movies like Phantom of the Opera for Joel Schumacher, 300 for Zack Snyder had been his biggest hit by distance. But more recent productions such as Machine Gun Preacher, Gamer and The Ugly Truth, well, they hadn't really commercially built on that. And so a mid-budget action film seemed like quite a shrewd move. His deal also brought him in as a producer, and Butler had input on the creative direction of the movie as well. But if there was any possibility of any dithering at all on what would become Olympus Has Fallen, that was soon erased by the news that the film had a very high budget competitor from Sony Pictures that was making a film called White House Down that we're going to talk about in the second half of this episode. But it would be disingenuous not to acknowledge that the two were jostling each other along. Here we had two films that were both being described as Die Hard in the White House that were rushing to arrive in cinemas roughly in the same window of time, and so the pace had to be picked up. As the Hollywood Reporter put it, it quoted insiders as saying the race to the screen is so intense that Millennium is fast-tracking Olympus Has Fallen for a June production start. So this is just 3 months after it had picked up the script, and with a lot of pre-production work needed to be done, plus no director on board. It should be noted that Butler's involvement also knocked him out of what would become the second film in the 300 big screen saga. But the wait for a director, well, it wasn't too far away. In April 2012, Antoine Fuqua, last heard of on this podcast when we were chatting about The Equalizer, was in talks to direct. Now, he and Butler, as I understand it, sort of knew each other. Fuqua had a boxing background or some degree of boxing expertise as well. He had broken through with the film Training Day, and more recently at this point he'd done the movie Brooklyn's Finest as well. He was making Tears of the Sun with Bruce Willis as well, and he was available to take on this particular action movie. He duly signed on the dotted line in April 2012. And then come May 2012, with the knowledge that the other movie was going by the title of White House Down, I didn't know this until I started digging in, Olympus Has Fallen had a very temporary title change, that it was taken to the Cannes Film Festival under the name White House Taken, where for a few weeks that was what it appeared to be called. And the reason it had to go to Cannes was that US distribution hadn't been sorted, and Millennium was basically looking for distributors for the picture. I mean, it was fairly confident it was going to get them, but Gerard Butler was duly brought along for a party in Cannes on May the 19th, and the distribution rights around the world soon came together. Useful for Millennium because the film was going to cost in the region of, about $60-70 million to make, and that was stretching the kind of budgets that it was paying for roughly around this time. Casting could now accelerate at speed. This was definitely going to start shooting, and so June 2012, Angela Bassett was confirmed. She was, I think, the second cast member to be absolutely on the dotted line with the film. She was also lured in by the fact that Morgan Freeman was interested in appearing. He also came aboard in June 2012. Come July, I mean, they were flooding in. That's when we got people like Ashley Judd and Robert Forster, Melissa Leo. Rick Yoon also signed up for a villainous role. And these names were confirmed in the trade press on the eve of filming starting, as was the budget of $70 million. As was the fact that Olympus Has Fallen, a film about the White House, an attack on the White House, was not going to be going anywhere near Washington for the vast bulk of its filming. Now, the movie's name had roughly changed back around this time, I understand. It's dallying with a change to White House Taken. It hadn't taken too long. And all the while that was going on anyway, pre-production was very much underway in the Louisiana area in Shreveport in the US, where, well, basically a White House was being built and eating up a good chunk of the budget. Now, Fuqua and Butler were getting on as well, and as Gerard Butler would tell my old mate Duncan Bowles, writing for Den of Geek, he said it was amazing how in cahoots and how coordinated Antoine and I were about creating this project. Because as Butler said, when he first got the script, the second that a C-130 flies in, you go, oh, wait a minute, what have I gotten myself into here? But Butler also noted that he felt a lot of it was a bit watered down and a bit sci-fi at first, his words. And he said, I thought we had a real chance to push the limits here and say, what does a real terrorist attack look like? And basically not shy away from that, to look right at it and show everything. It was thus Butler's idea to really up the violence of the film. And the film would attract a lot of criticism for just how violent it gets. But he explained, he says, you can't just show a terrorist attack where men die or an interrogation where only men are hurt. You know, women would be, quote, kicked the crap out of too. He wanted all characters to be in the firing line. And again, I acknowledge up front, this was something that the film really did get quite a lot of pushback for when it was eventually released in cinemas. But we jumped ahead because it hadn't even started shooting. The production started in earnest on July the 9th, 2012, after a very fast construction of the assorted sets required in the Louisiana area. And as Butler told The Hollywood Reporter, he said it was weird to watch it go up for me, but he added especially for people in Shreveport because it was then even weirder to watch it come down. He talked about how we were just blowing up the guard boxes and the whole White House, and Butler explained that he flies helicopters sometimes because of course he flies helicopters, and he flew over there when it was just destroyed, and he said it was amazing to see the wreckage from a bird's eye view, but it was also really cool, he said. Now, it had to be a very nimble shoot, that the prep time had been curtailed by the fact that this was now a race to the screen. And that meant that there wasn't months and months of training that could be done beforehand, even though there were experts on hand to teach Butler how his Secret Service character would behave. He talked too about how some of the fight scenes that they put together in the film really had to come together very quickly indeed. Butler described how they were working on the script all the time and always pushing each other and saying, okay, how can we create another twist? How can we show another emotional moment or something that says more about the character? And how can we show the journey in the White House and constantly be raising the stakes? I mean, having watched the film, I'd suggest the answer to most of those questions is by smacking people in the mush. But moving on, and what he described was how the fight sequences were always changing as the script was slightly changing, as their ideas were slightly changing. He said 1 minute you had a fight sequence and then you realise that 1 minute it's going to happen here, not there, and that there'll be 5 people in it and not 2. And Butler was having to learn moves for fight sequences as little as a day ahead in some instances during the production of the film. He was always saying too that it was calling bull hit, it says here, and saying what makes sense from a dramatic point of view. That was the key thing. That a Secret Service agent was on hand to tell them what wouldn't work for the Secret Service side, whereas the production team was saying, well, that wouldn't work from an action side as well. And they were kind of working with each other a little bit to just try and find some middle ground there. Butler would describe as well to the Hollywood Reporter about a fight he had with the character played by Dylan McDermott and how he flicked a cigarette into my neck during the production, which was part of the scene, but because I was supposed to be sweaty and I had glycerin on, the top of the cigarette, the lit part, stuck to my neck. Imagine that, sticking to Gerard Butler's neck. And he says, at first I think everybody thought I was just being a whiny baby until the next day it came up in a big scab. So out come the pot of makeup just to help cover all of that up. For Aaron Eckhart in a supporting role, and a very presidential supporting role, he would spend most of the film chained up, and not in a kinky way either. Again, as he would tell my old friend Duncan Bowles, he said, I couldn't feel my arms for 3 weeks. He said, I'm not kidding you. I went to the medic. I said, my arms are numb. I lost feeling from here down. And he says, we were up there 8 hours a day, and you want to be a tough guy. You don't want to take your arms down and stay in character and all that kind of stuff. And thus his arms had to pay some degree of penalty for that. Elsewhere, there were other challenges too in and around the film. That the movie was shooting across the summer, right down to the motorcade incident. Those who've seen the film will know that I mean. That pretty much opens the movie. Now, this takes place in the snow. It happens very early in, as most openings to movies do. And this was a case of one of the many digital effects that had to be put into the film because, again, they were shooting nowhere near Washington. They were shooting in the wrong time of the year as well. And so snow was put in. And also at one stage, digital cars were put into the sequence just to help them put it together. That a company called Ghost VHX in Denmark was handling the effects for that particular opening sequence and were having to throw in cars, backgrounds, snow, all sorts of things. The Shreveport shoot of the film required a White House, and in the end what they decided to do was to build the front face of the north side of the White House. They built stairs, they built a fountain, and this is all thanks to FX Guide for telling us this. They built the driveway. They didn't put any trees in. There were lots of trees at the real White House. The trees had to be put in post-production. But there were lots of background plates and lots of effects involved in here. In fact, basically, a lot of the look of the film, far more than you might expect, had to be built digitally. That even though Olympus Has Fallen has the feel of an old school action movie, in the end it was said that there are about 1,300 effect shots that ended up in the film. Now, when production had begun on Olympus Has Fallen, it was known that White House Down was happening, and Sony had also seized an initiative, as we're going to talk about just shortly, in announcing the release date for White House Down, and it was the first out the traps just to put a date out there. In the case of Olympus Has Fallen, I mean, by the time production wrapped on September the 15th, 2012, the US rights weren't confirmed. Now, they may have been sold behind closed doors, and there were distribution rights right around the planet that had been worked out, but the gauntlet really wasn't fully thrown down because the US rights only were announced as being picked up by Film District in America in October of 2012, and Film District took one look at what Sony had and just decided to up the ante. It promptly announced a release date of April the 5th, 2013. Now that put it several months ahead of the release of White House Down, knowing, as we're about to discover, that Sony just didn't have the wiggle room to do anything about that. By hook or by crook, Olympus Has Fallen, which had to race through production to get this far, was going to be in cinemas first, and it had the upper hand on its rival. I mean, who wants to release second? Now, again, I should note there have been battles of films in the past that have not quite worked out as you might have originally expected. We talked about Ants a few weeks ago on this podcast. Ants came out before its rival A Bug's Life, and it was A Bug's Life that made the most money, although both were hits. The asteroid hitting the Earth season saw 1998's Deep Impact go head-to-head with Armageddon. Well, Deep Impact was out first. Armageddon, again, made the most money, but once again, both were hits. So there's reason really for optimism on both sides as the film, as Olympus Has Fallen, headed before critics and headed towards cinemas. The initial response to the film was hardly glowing either, that this was a very brutal action movie. And whilst Gerard Butler's star power was praised, and whilst Antoine Fuqua's direction was also praised, the sheer level of violence was there was a lot of pushback against it as well. Also, the fact that did it really emerge out of Die Hard's shadow? Was this just going to be kind of one of those one-hit things that took its money and just ran away and was never heard from again? Well, you sort of know the answer to this one already. I mean, the film opened the weekend of March the 22nd to the 24th in the US, and it opened in a very, very healthy second place as well. For Film District, it was delighted with the $30.3 million opening weekend that the film enjoyed. Film District, not a massive studio, wasn't looking for $100 million opening. $30 million was delicious amounts of money, thank you very much. The film that was keeping it off the top spot was the other big opener that weekend, which was The Croods, which had $43 million in the bank. But it would be fair to say the crossover audience between The Croods and Olympus Has Fallen was not said to be on the very high side, although I should point out the first film that one of my children went to see when they were in a basket when they were still in their carry basket, was Olympus Has Fallen. Start 'em young, that's very much my motto. The other films that were around the same weekend, I mean, there was a fair amount of competition. I mean, the other opener was the film Admission, which came in at $6 million in fifth place. But Oz the Great and Powerful was up to week 3 and was in third place with another $21 million in the bank. The thriller The Call was out there, $8.9 million on its second weekend, sat in fourth place. And the rest of the top 10 was made up of films like Spring Breakers, The Incredible Burt Wonderstone, Jack the Giant Slayer, and Identity Thief as well. In fact, in 10th place was a Dwayne Johnson action vehicle called Snitch, which was some degree of competition for Olympus Has Fallen, but Snitch had hung around for the best part of, a month and a half as well. To the delight of Film District, I mean, Olympus Has Fallen hung around. It lost 53% of its business on its second weekend, even as competition arrived in the form of G.I. Joe: Retaliation, which was the number one film the following week. Temptation: Confessions of a Marriage Counselor opened with $21 million. I can barely recall that film at all. And The Host was coming out that weekend in the States as well, in 6th place. But Olympus Has Fallen stuck around in the top 5, even as Jurassic Park got a re-release the week after, even as the 2013 reboot of The Evil Dead turned up. And by the time Olympus Has Fallen left US cinemas, after a very healthy run as well, I mean, it played for most of the year on and off, it had banked $98 million in America alone. It had done another $71 million outside of the US. And so this $70 million action film had grossed $170 million. And that was the kind of money that, for Film District as well, was just like, well, it might just be a case of let's have another one. Just before I get to those other ones, there were a pair of legalities that sprung up around Olympus Has Fallen. Now, more recently, it was reported that Gerard Butler had filed a lawsuit against the production companies behind the film, arguing that he's owed $10 million in profits from, I think, just from the first film. The suit was against the company's New Image, Millennium Media and Padre Nuestro Productions. And out of the $170 million earnings at the box office, Butler argued that he was entitled to a slice of that. I don't know how that has played out. I've done a bit of digging around. I would just suggest that we've been waiting for a fourth film in this particular saga for a little while, and it hasn't turned up yet. And I wonder if that is in some way related. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not taking sides on this whatsoever. Now, the other legality that cropped up that I'm also not taking sides on, well, we have to go right back to Near the Story again. Because in 2002, let's go back to Creighton Rothenberger, one of the two credited writers on the film. he had actually registered a 48-page treatment with another writer called John S. Green, which was said to cover much of the same ground, allegedly covering much of the same ground. Now, when the script sold, Rothenberger allegedly failed to disclose that Green had been a co-author of the screenplay. This was thus pursued via legal remedies, that Green sought a declaration of copyright co-ownership as well, and he was also after his slice of the funds, as he saw he was entitled to. Now, this was allowed to pursue in court as well, and again, even though exact details of everything weren't reported, we did get a few details that popped up in a report over at Yahoo Finance that Green and Rothenberger, it said, litigated the rights to the movie script in California court, and according to Stabile, Green testified that the script in 2012 had been heavily edited and revised. The script sold in 2012. However, the parties at this stage settled the dispute. That the cost of the screenplay that was bought was said to be in the region of $175,000, but then presumably add-ons when it was made. Green received what was said to be a total, again, I'm reporting what Yahoo Finance said, $194,687, which included basically him surrendering his rights to the film and to sequels. And that brings us to the sequels, because Olympus Has Fallen proved to be a really profitable film, and it also proved to be the kind of film that worked very, very well on home formats as well. And so somewhat inevitably, the plan was, let's make another one. The announcement came in 2014 that London Has Fallen was going to move ahead. Different director as well. Babak Najafi was on board. Creighton Rothenberger, Catherine Benedict were two of the four screenwriters on the movie. And this time it would cost a little less money to make, and the overall box office would be slightly up, although it's worth noting that London Has Fallen is very much a low point for the series, and a film where the level of pushback and just, well, I mean, it felt outdated at the time, let's just put it that way, and if you like computer graphics from Call of Duty games, it might just be your kind of film, such is the look of it. Things took a significant uptick, however, with 2019's third movie in the series, Angel Has Fallen, and the plan continued after Angel Has Fallen for at least 3 more sequels and a TV series as well. The first of those sequels was going to be Night Has Fallen, but at the point this podcast is being recorded in June of 2023, no sign of it moving forward, although presumably whatever legal wrangles are ongoing will soon be sorted out. Given that a $70 million original has gone on to spawn a box set, a trilogy of films, and that there's very much a path in place to make more of them and a star who can continue to put backsides on seats, it feels like a certainty that we will fall again at some point. We wait and see. In the meantime, Olympus Has Fallen got out into cinemas before its big rival, and we're going to have a look at its rival just after we've done a few bits and bobs. And that leads us neatly to the halfway of the podcast parish notices part. So first and foremost, thank you for listening. I always appreciate people take the time to listen to this and to listen to me waffling on. If you, by some miracle, happen to like this podcast, there are 3 ways you can support it, which I'd be hugely obliged for any of these. If you like us that much that you want to support what we're doing financially and put some coins in the pot, if you head to patreon.com/Simon Brew. Patreon supporters, thank you so much everyone who does this. Get the podcast early pretty much every week. They get the ad-free version of it as well, and they find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes. So there's quite a bit going on at the moment as well. I'm going to be writing the Patreon post just after this. Costing you absolutely nothing is to subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice. That's appreciated as well. And likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, things like that for independent podcasts such as this are absolute gold dust and much appreciated. We're also putting the finishing touches to the 44th issue of Film Stories magazine. We'll have more news on that next week, goes the plan. If you head to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's when you'll find all of our print magazines that are currently available to order. And again, we do Film Stories and we also do Film Junior, which remains, to my knowledge, the only regular film magazine for under 15s in print that's also written primarily by under 15s too. We're really proud of it. That's at store.filmstories.co.uk. But that is enough parish notices, because we've got to go and blow the White House up again, fictionally on screen, don't come at me. as the other 2013 Die Hard in the White House movie now comes into focus. As always, I'm going to set it all up with a clip from a trailer, and we're going to come to the story of this particular production the other side of this.
Hey, can I show you something?
These are White House passes.
Your dad here has a job interview with the Secret Service.
No way. This is really cool.
John Cale. Why do you want to be in the Secret Service?
I can't think of a more important job than protecting the president.
In college, you barely maintained a C average. You're not to look at Agent Todd.
Special Agent Todd keeps making those sounds. I'm gonna start looking at him.
Did you get the job?
Yeah, I think I got a shot. You know how it is. You gotta go talk amongst themselves.
If you are just tuning in, we are going to breaking news out of Washington.
This is John Cale. I'm in the White House.
They've taken the building and they're holding hostages, including my daughter.
Alpha 1, do you have the target? Roger that. We're holding the president in the library.
That's the library. Don't go in there. Just... Oh, this is so stupid.
Libraries, eh? That is from 2013's White House Down, directed by Roland Emmerich, written by James Vanderbilt, and starring Channing Tatum, Jamie Foxx, Maggie Gyllenhaal, Jason Clarke, Richard Jenkins, and James Woods. So this is, it's pretty much as fast a tale as Olympus Has Fallen once it actually got going. But the story of White House Down began with a different Roland Emmerich project, one that was planned, a sci-fi movie by the name of Singularity. Now, Singularity had been backed by Sony Pictures, was going to cost $175 million to make, but given that Emmerich had made 2012 for Sony and that had made an awful lot of money, well, it just seemed like a shrewd investment for the studio. Emmerich had just done the film Anonymous, a much smaller drama that hadn't done any great guns really, either critically or commercially, but when it came to big screen disaster movies, a fairly bankable name. And so it got to the point where Singularity was due to actually start filming in March of 2012, and Emmerich was meeting actors, or at least he was due to meet actors for the project in November 2011. That a script had been prepared, was ready, was moving forward. Sony was comfortable enough to sign off the budget. The person who was having doubts about it was Roland Emmerich. And the story was going to follow a young man whose body is made up of a swarm of nanobots. And these nanobots would give the young man all sorts of powers, but also an evil corporation would get involved. And Emmerich had penned the script for it with a frequent collaborator of his, Harold Closer. But he was thinking of bringing in a futurist by the name of Ray Kurzweil on board to consult and work on Singularity, and really to go backwards on it, that he wasn't comfortable with the position the script was in, and he was having nagging feelings that Singularity wasn't quite there. And so he went to Sony and just said, I think we need to pause it. I think we need to go back on the script. And so that starting date then was, well, it just basically wasn't going to happen. The film had been earmarked for a November the 1st, 2013 release, but the studio in the end was all right with Emmerich stepping back from it, but also it had something else up its sleeve. Because in March 2012, just a couple of months later, Sony snapped up a spec script. Now, we've already discussed those in this episode, but in this case, the spec script was from a writer called James Vanderbilt, who more recently has been working on things like the Amazing Spider-Man movies, for instance. At this point, he'd done Zodiac, arguably David Fincher's best film, which I will come to in a future episode of the podcast. And in the case of White House Down, it was a script that Vanderbilt had been working on the quiet for a while, and he just happened to get it to market, out to agents, out to studios, at the point that Olympus Has Fallen was being announced. Now, what raised eyebrows was the fact that Sony was willing to stump up a lot of money just for the script alone. Because it was at the advice of Vanderbilt's agent that he still sent the script out, even though it was known that Olympus Has Fallen was moving and had Gerard Butler involved as well. And so the script to White House Down went out to market, and it went to Sony the same day it went to market, and then by the day after it was sold. By Friday it had a director, and by Sunday it had a green light. And Sony had paid $3 million for a spec script. Now, this was absolutely eyebrow-raising. Because if we go back to like the 1990s, paying that amount of money for a spec script, films like Basic Instinct, The Long Kiss Goodnight, Jade from Joe Esterhaus. These were selling for $3-4 million at a time, but the spec script bubble had very firmly burst and studios weren't paying that much money for an off-the-shelf screenplay. And so the fact that Sony all of a sudden did, well, that almost felt like we'd gone back 20 years. However, the $3 million deal was quickly sealed, and Roland Emmerich just seemed the likely candidate once Sony had decided it wanted the script. So on that Thursday, when it picked up the script, well, by Friday, the approach had gone in to Emmerich, because as he would reveal during the publicity for White House Down, he'd already had a White House movie in some degree of gestation that Sony had turned down before. And this was a script by the name of One Nation, a film that Emmerich was interested in making. And Emmerich reckoned that it was that had lodged into the head of Sony chief at the time, Amy Pascal. And so when White House Down crossed her desk, Emmerich seemed a likely person to send it to. Furthermore, Emmerich didn't have an active project at that point. Singularity was going back into the scripting stage. He was available, and whilst he would want some script tweaks to be made to White House Down, he signed up to do it, and that green light was given in absolutely double quick time. This whole process from Sony receiving the script to agreeing to spend a 9-figure sum making the film was a matter of half a week, an incredibly fast turnaround. And I've done like 200, 300 episodes of this podcast, and there are very few instances I can count of a decision-making process in Hollywood going anywhere near that fast. Now, amongst the tweaks that Emmerich wanted, well, he wanted changes to the villain role for a start, and he'd been taking a look at films such as Die Hard, inevitably, and Man on Fire as touch points for how to put an action film of this ilk together. That he'd done a lot of disaster movies, but this was very much a straight-out action film. It was, as Olympus Has Fallen was setting, going to be a Die Hard in the White House kind of movie, and he wanted to lean into that. Once we get into the film, one of the lead characters wears a dirty t-shirt in it, for instance, and that is a very, very direct and deliberate homage to the original Die Hard movie. Now, the acceleration things just kept going faster, because once Emmerich was signed up, well, he got in touch then with Channing Tatum, who was already making films for Sony. He'd done 21 Jump Street at this point, and he met up with Roland Emmerich about the film, and he was really keen to do it. And again, a really fast decision. Here was a big studio action movie that was being offered to him. He liked the father-daughter side of the screenplay as well, but also the idea of doing an action film with Roland Emmerich. That was right up Channing Tatum's street at the time. He was keen to do it, very much a star in The Ascendancy. The first Magic Mike had helped with that as well. The problem, though, was that Channing Tatum was in demand. In fact, he was committed to be doing a couple of other films, but most notably for the purposes of this story, he'd committed to make the film Foxcatcher, and he had a commitment to a start date for that film. So Sony had a decision to make. Do you go with Channing Tatum but move the production forward of White House Down, or do you delay the whole project and wait for Channing Tatum, or do you recast? Well, Sony wanted Channing Tatum, that much was obvious, and the idea of delaying just was not an option, because constantly the studio was looking over its shoulder, and there was Olympus Has Fallen with its start date, and it was moving at speed. And so the decision was made to cut the pre-production time down on White House Down from the planned 15 weeks down to an insanely tight 8 when you consider just what had to be built and put together. And the clock was ticking right from the off. That Channing Tatum was announced in May 2012, and Sony was confident enough to announce its planned November 2013 release date at this stage as well. Ironically enough, November the 1st, 2013, which was when Emmerich's Singularity was due out. That Emmerich had committed to making another huge blockbuster film, with 3 months after he'd stepped away from another one to buy himself a bit of time on it, and now he was going to be really a rush to the finish line to hit a November release date the following year. Maggie Gyllenhaal was in talks for the film in June 2012 as well, and Jamie Foxx signed up around then. James Woods followed up in July, signing up for a notable role. I think it was his last big Hollywood movie role as well, before he discovered Twitter in earnest. And while all the casting was going on, well, they had to build a White House. And not unlike Olympus Has Fallen, they did not decide to go to Washington, D.C. to shoot their film. That they get some exterior bits and bobs there. However, Emmerich was against the clock. He needed the control. He needed a concentrated environment. And so the decision was made to go to Canada and recreate a White House there. And this had to be an accurate one. Emmerich would talk in interviews about how he'd been in the White House, that when Bill Clinton was the incumbent there, he invited Emmerich in to screen Independence Day. They also got in touch with the White House Historical Society, and that society provided the filmmakers with prints of the oil paintings that are hanging for real in the White House as well. Some of the production team, including Emmerich as well, also got to take the tour. John McCain was said to have been quite helpful in giving them bits of access. However, they still needed to build some 45 sets to stage White House down. They also needed vehicles for a long 6-7 minute on-screen chase sequence that was planned. They needed a Pentagon. They needed the White House, of course. And so they decided they needed sound stages, that they had to build all of this. They had to do it at great speed as well. The irony is that somewhere else in America, in Louisiana, someone else was building a White House as well, just as the Sony team was putting together theirs over in Canada. They did have consultants on hand, of course, just to tell them they got the accuracy right. They also had consultants, because they were having to do bits of guesswork. They couldn't see all of the White House. If they got slightly close to the truth than was comfortable for Secret Service and government agents, they were warned off in another direction. That was one of the roles of the consultants of the film, to not get it quite as accurate as the US government would have liked. Still, it was all, around 2/3 of the White House was recreated for White House Down, and all the while the script was just being angled a little bit more towards Channing Tatum, just to shape his character a little bit. And production could begin in July 2012 in Montreal. If we go back to when the actual script sold, this is a matter of 4 months from the script selling to everything being built and production getting underway and cameras rolling. And in the midst of it all, Sony, because it had been able to get to the start line very, very quickly, Sony changed its release date as well. No longer was this going to come out in November. It was going to move to June the 28th, 2013, a high summer release day. Just really days before the July the 4th weekend, where Emmerich had enjoyed significant success in the past. And it was interesting that Sony decided to move its release date forward 5 months at that point, because Olympus Has Fallen at this stage hadn't got its US distribution in place, and it certainly didn't have a US release date. What Sony was trying to do here was put its foot to the floor and get its film out first, and moving the release date forward so dramatically was very much a signal of intent. Now, Sony was able to organise various outlets to go along and do set reports for White House Down. And so, for instance, Coming Soon went along and described the production as quite a whirlwind. That on the one hand, backing plates and helicopter shots were being put together in Washington, D.C. But over at ADF Studios in Montreal, well, that was handling the set for the White House. That ADF Studios used to be a bridge factory, to give you some idea of the scale and size of what was being put together. And the production, because of the truncated pre-production time, it was quoted as 32 set designers who were having to work 7 days a week. Construction was working on a 24-hour schedule just so that they could get the physical side of the movie in place for when the actors were ready to go. There was also Channing Tatum's very firm out time, that he had a 2-month window to shoot White House Down. Ordinarily, if you had a major actor leading a major studio action movie, you would expect to get 3, 4, 5 months with them. He had 2 months before he had to report to the set of Foxcatcher. And as Emmerich would tell Collider, the actor we wanted was Channing Tatum. Channing Tatum had another movie to shoot come the 10th of October. So we had just his end date, and it forced us to accelerate the whole pre-production. Now, Emmerich admitted it was tough on the production designer, but also conceded it was pulled off, and that it was added extra challenges for the editors and for the visual effects. And he argued really that everyone else could kind of scale around the fact that you had less time, but it was editing, visual effects and pre-production that really the squeeze was on. Now, that's not to say that the physical days of production were particularly easy, that they were going 13 to 14 hours on a very physical movie, that they were working 6 days a week. and Emmerich had to deliver his full completed final cut of the film 14 months from saying yes to the script. Now, interestingly, he would admit that he'd made a big film faster than that. He said 2012 came together in less time. I've seen 2012. I can understand that that took slightly less time to do. I think a little bit of script work would have helped on that particular project. In the midst of all of this, Tatum was fairly insistent that, this was his big action film. He was going to do the vast bulk of his own stunt work, even though there was some to and fro on that. And then Emmerich had learnt some lessons from shooting the film Anonymous that I briefly mentioned before as well. And as a result, he was determined to give this a slightly different look, that he veered towards wide lenses that ordinarily wouldn't pop up so much in action cinema. And he confessed that the use of wider lenses on Anonymous had swayed his decision-making there. He also shot the film entirely on digital. Now, that would make it slightly nimbler for the edit as well. And filming would wrap up by the end of 2012. I think it was early December the last shots were in the can. Tatum had long gone to go off and make Foxcatcher, so the schedule had to be angled around his working time as well. But by this stage, at the point that filming wrapped up, Sony knew that Olympus Has Fallen was going to win the race to the big screen. That by this stage, the US distribution for Olympus Has Fallen had, as I previously discussed, been picked up. It was going to be in cinemas a good couple of months before White House Down. And so what else really could Sony do but go full pelt and just try and hit that summer release date to amp up the marketing and distribution spend on the film? And by the end of it, it would have spent about $150 million just on the negative for the film. It's costing twice as much as Olympus Has Fallen. And in the post-production, that was tight as well. It was 6 months to turn it round. And there was a lot of VFX work, perhaps not as much as Olympus Has Fallen, but still, it was 6 months to nail the edit. And Emmerich reflected on this. He just said, I don't necessarily think a longer editing time is better. He says it's just tougher because nobody really does it anymore like that. But he did argue the good thing is when it's right. So you're not fiddling around on it too long. That because of the fact that it was all accelerated to the degree it was, they were having to make really quite fast decisions on the film. And they knew that they had this hard release date that Sony was insisting on as well. And to Emmerich's credit, they got the film completed. It was done on time as well. And it went before critics in time too. There was a little bit of wiggle room, and Emmerich had the space to do a great big round the world tour to promote the film as well, or at least he was doing interviews that were taking place around the world. The response, inevitably the comparisons were drawn with Olympus Has Fallen. Less violent. This was a PG-13 action movie. But I think that on the whole, the general critical consensus to White House Down was okay-ish, in the middle-ish, nothing particularly spectacular. I think the reviews would have been about 5% better had it been the first film out of the gate. But Sony wasn't massively worried about that. It was more worried about, will audiences want to see two Die Hard in the White House movies in a year? And the answer to that was, ish, I guess. That the weekend of June the 28th to the 30th, White House Down opened in a surprisingly low 4th place at the US box office. It had an opening weekend of $24.8 million. The competition was, there was some big movies around. Monsters University topped the chart on the week of its release. Monsters University had been out for a week already, still banked 45 million. So that was the family money cleared up. The Heat from Paul Feig was opening that weekend as well in 2nd place. An R-rated comedy, $39 million. And it's the forgotten Paul Feig film, I think The Heat is a little bit. I'm a fan of that one. We've talked about it on a previous episode of the podcast where we did a full in conversation with Paul Feig, and he touches on that too. I think the film that did the damage to White House Down's box office, though, wasn't just Olympus Has Fallen. It was the enduring success of World War Z, which had proved to be a very welcome hit for Paramount Pictures after a difficult production. And on World War Z's I can't call it World War Z, I'm sorry, I'm from the UK. On World War Z's second weekend, it grossed just shy of $30 million, more than White House Down managed on its opening weekend. There was lots of competition around. Man of Steel was about. Now You See Me was about. That was a hit out of nowhere as well. Fast and Furious 6, Star Trek Into Darkness. Iron Man 3 had just dropped out of the top 10 as well. And then for July the 4th weekend, or July the 5th to the 7th, the following week, Despicable Me 2 came along, $83 million just in one weekend. The Lone Ranger, which is regarded as a high-profile flop, grossed $29 million on its opening weekend. It was just a far more expensive film to make. And White House Down had lost 45% of its business. It was clear that it was going to tumble here. Pacific Rim popped along the weekend after, as well as Grown Ups 2. They both made quite a lot of money too. And White House Down dropped out of the top 10 by the weekend of July the 19th to the 21st, when movies such as The Conjuring, Turbo, Red 2, R.I.P.D. were all coming out and giving it some fairly fierce competition. To Sony's disappointment, White House Down's US gross then topped out at $73 million. But on the plus side, outside of the US, it did some pretty solid business, $132 million for a worldwide gross of $205. So you put these two films side by side, and White House Down made more money than Olympus Has Fallen, an extra $30 million over its competitor. The downside was it cost twice as much to make and presumably about twice as much to market as well. So when it came to absolute profit, White House Down was not winning that battle at all. Nonetheless, it was the film that grossed the least money that was the one that spawned the franchise and went on for several sequels and continues to go on for several sequels. Whereas White House Down, well, I mean, if I had to choose between the two of them, I have to say I'm team White House Down, just because I think its tongue is rammed so far into its cheek and they're clearly having so much fun with it that I just think it's a bit of a blast of a film, really. I think what I like about White House Down is they introduce a whole lot of stuff in the first half hour of the film and pretty much they use every last bit of it they possibly can thereafter. It would be one of the last real, the penultimate studio big blockbuster movie that Emmerich would make today. He would do Independence Day Resurgence a few years later for Fox, but that's one for another time. Before moving to independently funded blockbuster movies, I think you have to call them, Midway in 2019 and Moonfall, which I've covered in a previous episode in 2022. But also it's the last time he took on a full-on, straight down the line action movie. The first time as well, I'd suggest too. And I think it stands out actually as one of the better films in his catalogue. And I'm not damning with faint praise there. I think Emmerich's done some really enjoyable films. I think he's done some less enjoyable films as well. I think White House Down is the proverbial Friday night, get a few drinks in, have a nice takeaway, put your feet up, and it's a bit of a blast. Nonetheless, it might have won the battle. It didn't win the war. And since 2013, we've had precious few examples of films competing on exactly the same kind of subject matter at exactly the same kind of scale. I think in hindsight, it's clear that they both took some degree of lumps out of each other, that this wasn't a case of one fueling the other, but also a really competitive year 2013. There are more movies from it I'm going to investigate in the future as well, but that's all for future episodes of the podcast. For now, that brings me to the end of this one. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories. We're at Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online, youtube.com/Film Stories. You can find our website, filmstories.co.uk, which is updated every weekday with movie news, reviews and features. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can find our collection of magazines for sale. We do Film Stories magazine, Film Junior magazine. I've talked about them a little bit before. Store.filmstories.co.uk. We ship them around the world from there. And the Patreon, again, if you want to support us there, is patreon.com/Simon Brew. For now, I'm off to watch another bunch of movies and to start writing the next episode of Film Stories. I'll be back with that in due course. Until then, you all look after yourselves. You all take care. I'll be back soon. Bye-bye.